Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Hi, this is Adam Schwartz, the guest co-host on the Emerging Biotech Leader today, subbing in for Kim Kushner, who's out on maternity leave and doing great. I'm going to do my best to sub in and replicate her as best I can. I'm here today with Victoria Niklas, the CMO of Oak Hill Bio, and we're really interested in learning today a little bit about her journey with Oak Hill and previous to that, as she was in research and moving through in her career into Takeda and into pharma and elsewhere. So Victoria, welcome to the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. It's great to be here.
Could you maybe give us a little bit of an overview of your background to start off, and then obviously love to dig in and learn some best practices and ideas that you have?
Yeah, certainly. So I've been in pharma for about 7 years, and that was a journey that I made from academic practice. I was an academic neonatologist, translational scientist, sort of rising through the ranks in academia, most recently at UCLA here in Los Angeles, where I'm based. And it occurred to me in all the work that I had done and people I'd influenced, patients have always been the center of everything I've done, the science I've done and led. And I began to feel as if I wanted a bigger stage with which to have an impact, particularly in the care of extremely premature newborns where drug development in that area hasn't, rivaled that of other areas. And so in thinking about how best to do that, I was very fortunate in that I was approached by the CEO at Prolacta Bioscience who said, we'd love to have you come and join us as our first chief medical and scientific officer. We'd like to move our products, which are essentially nutritional products derived from human milk. We'd like to, look at our pipeline, figure out how to improve milk economics, expand product development. And given your work in, developmental mucosal immunology, and in particular, human recombinant lactoferrin, you seem like a great fit. And so I did thinking about that and, shared it with my mentors in the space. And, people are, well, you're leaving academics. There's uncertainty there, and I think not having a good view of that. So I took that opportunity, joined Prolacta, and essentially never looked back. And I was very fortunate to be recruited from Prolacta to join Takeda Pharmaceuticals to lead a drug pipeline focused on extremely premature newborns. So I'd spent, 25 years of my career caring for those infants at the bedside. And so that was the opportunity that then led me to become the chief medical officer at Oak Hill Bio, because Takeda opted to out-license that program. And I couldn't see fit from the chair I sat in at Takeda and all of the positive things I had done to really develop that program. I could not see going forward in my career without being having a continued impact on that program. And so once the deal was done, I, got into contact with those at Oak Hill Bio and said, look, this is my passion. This is what I'd love to do. And I'd like, to be considered as a part of this opportunity. And as it turned out, given that I had a history in immunology, a number of the other assets were actually in the autoimmune space. So it was really probably one of the first opportunities I've ever seen where you can practice as a neonatologist and leverage your experience in immunology. So it was a perfect kind of a lining up of me. And, I was very fortunate to make that transition at the top of 2022. So that's where I am. But there was a lot of me in the academic space for a long time that led to, my confidence in making that switch.
I was just going to ask, and you mentioned about transitioning from academia to pharma. What are some of those? I mean, that's not an easy thing to do necessarily. What are some of the transferable skills that you use? Maybe one or two from academia that you possess that was really helpful to make that transition to the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think one is particularly as a neonatologist where you sit in an incredibly busy, active clinical space, you've got to multitask all the time. So the patient's in front of you, yet there are conferences to hold with families. So you've got to have space for that, space for lab results, interpretation. So multitasking, sort of utilizing all of those skills. The other thing about neonatology is the neonatal intensive care unit doesn't function without a leader. And so you have to be able to leverage input from other leaders. Cardiothoracic surgeons come in with their opinions about what needs to happen. You've got to interact at that level, appreciate that information, interpret it, and then tell the team how to execute. And that goes from all the physicians to the nurses to the social workers to the families who ultimately are important. So multitasking, leadership. And then another really, really important aspect is guarded optimism, because, if you didn't believe in that, it would be almost impossible to keep yourself shored up to be that best representative in all of those functions. So I think being optimistic, but, and not necessarily guardedly so, but just realistically optimistic always.
Cautiously optimistic. Right.
And then thriving and surviving on, not much sleep. That's the other piece.
And Victoria, you mentioned some of your colleagues in academia sort of warning you as you were thinking about taking that step into pharma. And it's obviously something that many medical professionals and scientists go through, that they're, in academia and they're thinking about whether or not it's a good step for them. What are some of the things that maybe colleagues of yours were warning you about? And then what were some things, were they true? Were they not accurate? What did you find once you got to the other side?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is there was a perception, I think it's a dying perception, that when you transition to pharma or drug development from that side, you're selling yourself out. All you really care about is the big paycheck, and you're going to, work 9 to 5 and live on a yacht somewhere in the south of France. So you're selling out from what's absolutely, essential when you commit to an academic career, because those pieces are not necessarily what's driving your commitment. So I think most people spoke from that. You join pharma, now all of a sudden you're going to have fudged clinical trials. You're going to lose your objectivity. You're going to become tremendously biased. And, that's a bad thing. I think that's less of a sentiment now. And I think there have been changes to the industry. There may be, sordid tales that we could all sit around and tell. But I think that was the number one and the biggest one. And then some other minor things might be, you're really deserting the patients. You are really deserting the patients. And so that, just as an aside, was a very important thing for me when I transitioned from Prolacta to Takeda, that the patients that, I have cared for 25 years at the bedside are really front and center for me. That is, my heart is tied to that. I'm not, agnostic to what I do, because I'm driven by the desire to make things better.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I hear that from a lot of the academicians, that they do make that transition over, that actually is the patient is in the center of their thinking. And that's the reason that they make that transition, to be able to make an impact as a much more expansive, path as well, and have that opportunity to do that from the beginning, when the drug is being developed, or preclinical, and through the whole process of the clinical development. Why do you think that stigma is out there? Is it just lack of education or understanding, knowledge about what pharma does? And I agree with you that it's not as much as it used to be, maybe 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, but it's still there. Is that because the training in our medical school and pharmacy school, or is not designed that way, or what do you think that is?
Yeah, so a great question. I do think it is less now. I think a lot of it has to do with just no exposure to that. There's no class in medical school where you go to learn the pharmaceutical drug development process. So it is a gap. But appreciation for what the pharmaceutical industry and biotech are doing to expand drug development. I think that sentiment people completely understand and get. But so much of it, I think, is just not being aware of the nuances of it. Number one. Number two, the expense of it. And number three, how long it takes, to have a robust process to prove efficacy with an appropriate safety profile. But I think all of this is improving. I think, and as well, there's a lot more transparency in terms of what drug development is. And, one of the silver linings of the COVID pandemic was people became a lot more aware of what it takes to bring drugs through development and the processes and the safety checks and all of that. So the world is more in tune, with this. And that, also stems obviously to the academic health centers and physicians and other health professionals.
That's a really good point. And, one of the things you mentioned was sort of this concern of like a separation from the patient if moving from academia into industry. Is obviously your relationship with the patient changes, but have you found that you feel like you have less of an impact or more or the same? Like how has that changed for you?
Yeah. So at a one-on-one level, yes, because I'm not at the bedside. But from where I, really had seen myself evolve, I will always have deep empathy for patients and want to do the best that I can. But I feel very satisfied that, for example, at Oak Hill Bio, I'm driving development of OHB 607, which has the potential to change the trajectory. So I don't have to sit and remind myself why I'm doing that there are patients on the other end. But I also am involved in other activities that keep me very close to the patient experience. My work with patient organizations, advocacy organizations, conversations across the board, keep it front and center for me. So I don't feel that I'm no longer, in the mix, as it were.
And I want to ask you a question about the out-licensing agreement and establishing that agreement with Takeda and kind of navigating the waters through to the asset to the Oak Hill as the CMO. What did that take? How did you negotiate that strategy, or what were your negotiating strategy? What regulatory aspects you had to kind of consider in that whole process? Basically, how did you make that happen? I think this will be one area that our audience will be very interested to know how to do.
Yeah. So one of the things, Ramin, when Takeda made the decision to out-license, I was sitting in the global program leader seat. And that was an opportunity that came to me because the previous global program leader had left the company. And I had joined Takeda to lead their medical affairs group in this area. So it was a tremendous opportunity that I was able to take, but that became available to me. So my primary responsibility at the time the out-licensing was made aware for all of us, one was shoring up the team, because I think, given the nature of the population and the incredible connections that people on our team at Takeda had developed, we had to take the view that it's not over. Okay, this doesn't mean these patients will never receive this drug in the longer term. So shoring everybody up and keeping people laser focused on that. And the second thing was helping develop the message. How do you, because from Takeda's perspective, I was sitting there as the representative, as the one who was going to develop interest among the external parties. So how do you message that? And that was, a process with, lots and lots of hours on Zoom calls. All of the out licensing was done in a separate group at Takeda. And so the next time I picked it back up was when I was now sitting in the Oak Hill Bio seat. So I didn't have a lot of input into the out licensing other than to say, here's why this is absolutely critical to continue development. Here's what you need to understand about these incredibly fragile newborns and why this drug is going to be transformational. which is obviously, about not the medical, not the legal financial aspects of it, but the underpinning of its success.
Right. And it's interesting because by continuing to work with the program, you kind of have had this journey now where you've transitioned, from a large pharmaceutical company into an emerging biotech environment, but staying with the same program. How have you found that experience to be? Obviously, there are different challenges when you don't have all the structure and organization around you that a large organization like Takeda can provide.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say, simply eye-opening from the perspective of you don't really appreciate the depth behind all of the functions that you're using on a day-to-day level. Through a quick email, you may get back the input of 20 people and it's in one email. And so in the biotech, world, it's a thinner team with fewer experts. And so I think I understand the asset to a degree that far exceeds anything I ever could have probably developed at Takeda had it continued to grow there. So learning the deep nuances of CMC strategy, for example, was never something that I necessarily needed to know. I just needed the soundbite, or statistical modeling, or regulatory strategy, all of those things. I am a lot more comfortable with comprehensive understanding. That's kind of the way my mind works. So having had the opportunity, it's absolutely fantastic that I've had that, because I know we can, represent the drug more completely, the opportunity more completely, and in the end, execute more completely. And that's true not only for me as the chief medical officer, but our CSO, our CFO, our regulatory strategy, our investor strategy team. We have all become, the experts in this asset. I, of course, hold the medical expertise because of those 25 years of standing at the bedside doing. So it's, that was one of the big transitions from pharma to biotech in that process.
And Victoria, what about areas? And tell me if this was challenging or not. What about the areas like fundraising, for instance, or dealing and communicating with the investors community, and that's not necessarily an area that the CMO is the expert at. Coming, especially in your case, coming 25 years from treating the patients. How do you build that up? I'm sure at the beginning it might have been challenging. And where do you and how do you learn those to become expert as much as you can?
Yeah. So the backstory is that even in the academic world, I was always the front person for bringing funding for research in medicine. And obviously it's very different because a lot of that funding came from, philanthropic organizations who had earmarked the funds, regardless, almost not, no, I shouldn't say regardless, but basically they were going to your organization, but you had to put what was happening at the hospital for extremely premature newborns, if it were that space, have to put it into a soundbite that makes sense. You want to invest in research in this hospital for these reasons. So that's always been a part of who I am. Now, some of the big differences are, the investor community may be more or less aware of the challenges of extremely premature newborns. And, one has to be very selective as to how you describe things. Because if I tell you you're investing in an extremely fragile population, you're thinking, well, how successful will that ever be if it's that fragile? So really learning how to communicate in ways that are tethered to certainty, yet really treat in a very honest way, how your drug is actually going to make that better. And I will say, we started with the pitch deck that I developed at Takeda, and I was actually thrilled to see some of my same slides in the original pitch deck. But we've done a lot of modification Because if I say one thing one way and an investor responds in way X or way Y, pretty much it's working or it's not. And so it was really learning for all of us, I think, as to, how you do it. And of course, you can get training on how to give a pitch in 8 minutes and leave the room, with everybody behind you. It's a lot more complicated than that. And as well, getting out of, if you put a physician scientist in a room with 10 slides, the presentation you get is very different than you put the CFO in the room with those 10 slides. So it's learning to use the corporate language, putting that into your own words, because if you take away the thing that makes it unique to me, it then becomes a recording that anybody can give. So really understanding what are the key words or key phrases, or, without sounding, superficial, that you need to use, what works for people. And so that the community can say, hey, yeah, I get that. Okay, fragile, but yet, resilient, and therefore we can. And, that whole thing. So learning that language. And then there's also the other language of finance, which I have to say in the beginning was just mind-boggling, because when there are conversations around financial terms, you've actually never heard them before. I was like, what on earth is a pipe? What on earth, those kinds of things. So once you get the dictionary, it's like immunology. Once you have the dictionary of immunology, actually you can understand it. And so it was really building through a very informal process, the dictionary that goes with pitching a very important clinical stage asset to the financial community so that it sticks and doesn't frighten anybody away.
It's almost like you have to go back to school, kind of learn certain things so you can speak that language with your community, which is, I was just thinking as you were talking, that is not that much different than when you have to talk to a parent of a child, right? And you have to speak their language to be able to relay with them whatever it is that you're trying to communicate with them, and also be relevant for them, so they walk away educated and knowledgeable about the situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say that parents, in my view, are easier, but I've had 25 years to 30 years of experience, so I can't really say that.
That's another transferable skills that we were talking about earlier when we started the podcast.
Yeah.
So Victoria, you've been in this role of CMO for relatively short period of time, and it sounds like you've had a lot to learn quickly, certainly on like the investor presentation, fundraising pieces that we were just talking about, and I'm sure a myriad of other areas, because the role of the CMO is so complex. Are there certain things or tools that you've been drawing from in order to sort of get, learn quicker and try to make progress faster?
Yeah. So I did probably what anybody new to a role would do, is you go to see, is there a book that says, this is what you'll do as a CMO. This is how you'll handle various things. And certainly there are leadership, texts that speak to the roles, but there is no book for that. And so, one of the things that's always been really important across my life really is, using mimicry that fits with who you are. So really, paying attention to how people are speaking. I watch CMOs at some of these investor conferences and looking to see, what is their body language? How are they phrasing things? What are they doing? Grabbing conversations when I can. I have some close colleagues that have been very successful in drug development, and just trying to extract nuggets of what they've done and how they behave and how they prioritize. But everything in the end has to fit with who I am. So there's no book, but there are resources, obviously, as I mentioned. You can speak to somebody who does pitches, and they can listen to you pitch, and they can tell you everything you do wrong. And you take that and consider that success, right? Because if they tell you you're doing everything right, then there's something wrong with that consultant.
Right. Then you haven't found the right expert yet.
Yeah, exactly. So it's shaping, there are obvious things, right? You've got to be able to speak to investors. You've got to be able to speak to KOL groups, other HCPs, advocacy, and so on. but you learn by experience. And the world is obviously critical, but it's not unendingly critical to the point that you can't pivot, and make a change and be in one's own mind better the next time. Because a lot of what I've learned through life is that we are our own biggest critic. And so what you perceive as being like a total disaster on the outside, actually that was great. Thank you so much. So we learn from that as well. We learn to shape how we respond when you're on the spot and, things that you're doing. So no book that I would have to recommend, but one of the biggest things is just learning from the environment around you, being willing to change and modify, your behaviors, the way you speak and things like that.
No, that's a really good point. And also being okay with not knowing and looking bad, which is not necessarily an easy thing, right? It's that also kind of opens up the door, kind of having to keep in an open mind that, oh yeah, I really didn't know that. And maybe I shouldn't have said that, and be okay with that rather than pretending. You mentioned mentorship. And I wonder, and Adam also brought up if there was what are tools, what are things that you use. Yes, there's no book, but there's nowhere better than learning from others who've gone through that same experience and being a mentee in that particular relationship, or a mentor for others. What are some of your thoughts there? Can you think of an example or a situation that having a mentor was very helpful? And then also, are you mentoring others that are kind of maybe earlier in their career?
Yeah. So, I have a whole cast of people that I've collected across my journey in life that I consider, mentors or sponsors, somebody who's really willing to say, take this person, they can do it, and they'll fall on the sword for you. And so you might imagine, given the diversity of my career from, basic science in graduate school in biochemistry, where I, came to Harvard, say, I am going to be a scientist, because that's what I felt comfortable saying. Yet deep-seated in me was, I really want to be a doctor directing the best science to improve the healthcare of those people. And for me, I had to get my head around that to be able to say it, to proceed down the medical route, which I did pretty quickly after arriving at Harvard. And fortunately, I had the mentors that supported that. Whereas the mentor I had as an undergraduate was very much sell yourself as a physician, you're giving up on science, so pivoting and switching and still other fantastic advice. Don't say it was wrong. It was just the mentor's perspective, which is how it all comes. And so across my career in the different institutions across time, I've picked up mentors along the way. And even in making the transition from academics to proactive bioscience, I leveraged a lot of my mentors. And I mentioned one in particular who's been very successful in drug development, somebody I met while I was an associate professor at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Our labs were next door to each other. And so, she took an idea and it was picked up and she developed it and she won. And so the moment the opportunity presented itself to me, I was discussing it with her and saying, risk, benefit. And she said, all benefit. Knowing who you are, knowing the stage you're craving, stage meaning in terms of impact, you need to go for it. And then there were, bits and pieces elsewhere that supported that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how important, right, your sort of network and maintaining those mentors becomes for you, especially, later and later in your career as things get more complicated and as your skill set and job requirements become more and more multivaried. You need different types of advice, like exactly like what you were talking about before in terms of your role at Oak Hill and how, because it's a smaller company, you're wearing lots of different hats. It's one of the most challenging parts of the role of the chief medical officer is that you have to be the expert in the product and you have to be a great clinician and a great drug developer and a great fundraiser and a great leader and a great communicator. There's just so many. I probably just left off 7 or 8 other things you need to be great at as the chief medical officer.
Yeah. but that's a fantastic fit for who I am, because I think I'm not, if it were a single thing, if we could define a single thing I'd have to be great at, I would feel as if I wasn't working hard enough. So, there are dangers, obviously, in both of those scenarios, and we're making it very black and white. But I know when I've sought change in my career, it's because I feel like, I got that. I know how to resuscitate every sort of baby there is. I know how to call in a transfer. I know how to do this sort of procedure. And there's just this yearning and desire to be on the edge of new learning. So, lifelong learning, sometimes people would refer to it as that, but I like to stay fresh and challenged, because in opportunity, there is challenge, but, generally for me, it leads to, what I'm really striving for.
Right. The learning agility that you're referring to is absolutely a key for success. And you don't have to be a physician. And if you think about it in our life, just having that learning agility for anything that we do is kind of pushes you forward another one or two steps, and then it keeps building on each other, and willingness to learn on that. That this is great advice that you're giving, but what advice will you have? What are the one or two advice that you'll have for someone earlier in their career? Maybe they're in academia, they're considering maybe pharma, maybe they're an investigator on studies, and they're thinking about, well, maybe I should make that switch and go to pharma, or maybe they're in earlier stages as a CMO, and they're getting a little bit frustrated that there's it's a rough road ahead. What are the two or three key advice you would have for them?
Yeah, so I think, and it depends on stage. I mean, the other thing is I have a whole list of people that I have mentored. And in fact, many still keep in touch and reflect on those days when I said X, and they made, life-changing decisions because of that. So I think if somebody wants to change their situation, I think reflection on why is important, that it's not, something that's fixable. And usually by the time people are bringing it up, particularly sophisticated people, it's not that, it's that they don't like living in Los Angeles. It's not at that level. It's this desire or this, appetite to add things. And so I advise people, all the time. The Pediatric Academic Societies meeting is one of the largest pediatric-based meetings, which happens to be very research-focused. I will always make an attempt and go around and to the posters, because that's where you find the very young, just getting started undergraduates, medical students, fellows, and so on. And in many of those conversations, they look at your badge and say, "Oh, you're at Oak Hill. What is that?" And then, they would mention, "I'm very interested in that." I said, "Here's my phone number. Let's try and reach out or follow up on this." And then, it leads to further conversation. So advice is, if you're really feeling in you the desire to make a change, then take steps to begin to make that change. Part of it too is, how do you go from academics to the pharmaceutical industry or biotech? Well, you have to be recognized. So if you sit in the back of the room and never ask a question, you don't raise your hand, you don't go forward, to that booth at that very, very large meeting that has a product in the area that you're interested in, strike up a conversation with, the business development team and say, "Hey, I have some new data on this." It may or may not lead anywhere, but if you look for, opportunities around physician, investigator-led research opportunities, those are oftentimes gateways in. And mine was, one where the CEO, who was very inquisitive and kept his eye out for milk-related research, came to me and said, so making yourself visible is one of the key aspects. And then keep at it. Don't get discouraged. And then once you get there, realize that you are the learner. And I think, I think the transitions are hard when you feel like you're the one who knows everything. Research process, clinical development is very different than academic-led, can be very different than academic-led research from a time and money perspective, critically from a focus perspective. I mean, shaping your ideas, putting them into sound bites, all those things are super important. But I think opportunity is risk. And if that is not a good balance for you, you're going to know it very, very quickly. If opportunity is driving the energy that you have to do it even more, then, then it's definitely a path to go with.
And it's certainly not for everyone either. And I think that's perfectly okay too.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And you have to be okay with that, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I think I thought that you're kind of the learner when you move into some sort of new role really resonated with me. I think that's a really interesting point, Victoria. And it really is for any role in an organization. Like even as a CMO, right? You're learning new things every day. And we often talk to new leaders about that need for, when you first get into a new role in an organization, the first thing you should be doing is learning. You don't know everything about that organization or that program that you're working with or that disease state. Even if you're an expert in one of those areas, there's always things to be learning, and you really want to be onboarding as much of that information first as you're thinking about strategies and how are we going to improve and what are some of the next steps, right? And always just thinking about the fact that you're continually learning. There's always something new in any kind of new innovative challenge.
Yeah, I think the other thing I just want to mention in terms of once having made the decision that you're interested, identifying that opportunity and then evaluating that opportunity. There's so many things that go into job descriptions. Is it a virtual company? Is it, we are a virtual company. But I think a critical aspect that I would, say and attribute our success is, are the people I work with. And I've been, treasured to, really have to applaud my colleagues, and all that they've done to transition my role from, academics to pharma to biotech. I think that's been a really, really key piece.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, especially for really any organization and team, but especially a small organization, small team. You really need to learn everybody's skills and strengths and how to all work together. Well,
yeah.
I think that's sort of a great thought to maybe end our conversation on today. Really appreciate the discussion, Victoria, and I think you provided us with a lot to think about and a lot of helpful advice.
Yeah, well, it was a great pleasure.
Yeah, a lot of great insights.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ramin and Adam.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.